But for the sake of today, I'll primarily be focused mainly on the Node.js/Node repo, which is where we work and develop Node.js core, which is what most people think of when they think of Node. One thing I'll add really quickly, which is rather interesting, is we do vendor all of our dependencies in Node, which on one hand does make it a little bit more difficult for distribution in platforms like Debian, where they want to dynamically link everything. But what it also means is this repo is completely self-contained. With installing like build essentials, you more or less can compile on any Linux. It doesn't require anything else on the system. So we have a lot of different information in our README, but the main things that I wanted to point out towards this question regarding onboarding process is our current team members. So you'll notice that we have a technical steering committee. I believe there's 18 of us. You'll see we have emeritus of the steering committee, and then we have the collaborator list. You'll notice it is not a short list. There is over 100 collaborators, and we even have a lot of former collaborators. We recently introduced a new role called Triagers, of which I will show you all in a minute. And the release stuff we'll get to in a bit. We have release keys for all the people who are able to do releases. So the first thing that I would dig into here is like our governance, talking about the different roles. So I mentioned we have a triager role. This is a new role that we just opened. There's a guide for people who are triaging. They have the ability to apply labels to issues, as well as comment, close, and reopen issues. The project recently introduced the ability to kick off CI and land things through a commit queue through labeling, as long as like a handful of release gates and checks are done. So you'd need all the CI to be green. You'd need the right amount of sign off. And you'd need the commit to be able to land cleanly for it to work that way. But our triagers have the ability of doing all of that. And we recently introduced our first triager. Traditionally, we have our collaborators, and Node.js core collaborators maintain the Node.js Node repo. They have commit access to the repo and access to the Node CI. Both collaborators and non-collaborators can propose changes. For a change to land, 2 collaborators must have approved it, or 1 collaborator if the commit's been open for at least 7 days. If something's been open for 48 hours, it has green CI, it has 2 sign-offs on it, it can land, unless it's some major, in which case the TSC needs to approve it. If there are objections, we do work through a consensus-seeking process. We attempt to talk through those objections and find consensus. If consensus cannot be reached, most of the times that just means that the change doesn't land, but it can be escalated to the technical steering committee to either vote or reach their own consensus to override the objection. There's a handful of other activities for collaborators, but the one thing that you were asking was nomination. So it is a bit of, I think, shoulder tap is maybe the best way to describe it. But essentially, any existing collaborator can nominate someone else to be a collaborator. There is an expectation that nominees would have a significant or valuable contributions across the Node.js organization. So it doesn't need to be explicitly only in Node.js Node, although there is an expectation of familiarity because there is a bunch of work that needs to be done from a stewardship position. So to nominate a new collaborator, you can open an issue in the Node.js Node repository and provide a summary of the nominee's contributions, such as the commits in the Node.js repo, pull requests, comments on pull requests, reviews, help. And here are just like a handful of different queries ready to go that we can look at. So for example, if we did this one and we put in my name, I'm struggling to type because I am on a split ergonomic keyboard I don't normally use. But you can see, you know, for example, like all of my commits, and we'd go through and kind of list all of these things. For example, if we look at the repo right now, and we look at issues, and we look at nominate as maybe a keyword, we can see you know, like 100 closed nomination issues for different people. This individual is one of my colleagues, so I don't feel so bad highlighting. And this is for Roy, and Beth says that she'd like to nominate Roy, and this is actually pertinent to the question about the release group, because Roy is also a member of the release group. So Roy was nominated based on current and future contributions to the Node.js release group, that he's been regularly attending the fortnight release mentoring sessions for over 6 months and attends regular release working group meetings. He also helps to maintain NPM, which is a dependency within Node. The technical steering committee had already approved Roy to become a releaser, which is part of the release process we'll talk in a bit, and shows their commits, their comments, and their org-wide involvement. And so generally the way in which this works for nomination is you mentioned the collaborators, and if there's no opposition within a week to the nomination moves forward. Now, one thing that we do sometimes is there's a step where we go to the collaborators discussion page, which is a private discussion page only to the collaborators, to request feedback from collaborators in private before nominating an individual. We don't require this, but we do encourage it. It's not a lot of fun to nominate someone publicly and then have them removed. It's it's bad for everyone when that happens, to be honest. So after the nomination passes, there's a TSC member who goes through and works on what's the word I'm thinking of? Onboarding the individual. And so here you can see we have a full onboarding guide that goes through like the whole process of how we nominate people, what permissions we give them. And then internally, we extensively use IAM within the Node.js org by having a variety of teams in place for handing off permissions. So we don't like add people to repos specifically. We add people to a collaborations membership group, which underneath it has a bunch of other sub-teams for various working groups and other subsets. Before I move on, are there any other questions about onboarding for collaborators and the permissions we give?
At what point in there do you collect those public keys? I know you mentioned them, but at what point do you ask the person for theirs, and how do you get them?
Yeah, okay, so we should maybe move on to talking about releasers, because it's only the releasers whose keys that we keep on file. There isn't an expectation or even a collection of keys of collaborators. So those are only the release team that we maintain keys of. So one thing I wanted to touch on really quickly was like our charter and governance before I touch that specific point, Dan. So the Technical Steering Committee is chartered by the Cross Project Council and the OpenJS Foundation, and they're chartered with a number of responsibilities, including stuff like setting release dates, release quality standards, technical direction, project governance. The CPC in turn is actually chartered by the board of directors of the OpenJS Foundation, including their own list of responsibilities, which include overseeing the projects. The way in which this structure works actually continues to turtle when we go and look at the Node release working group, which has been chartered by the TSC to include release process, content for all releases, schedule for all releases, and contribution policy for the release repository. Why this is important is it talks about like a separation of concerns and a delegation of duty. So the board has delegated the Cross Project Council of the OpenJS Foundation with pretty much everything having to do with the open source volunteer-led side of Foundation activities. And in turn, the Cross Project Council delegates the management of every single project to the steering committee of the project through a charter. Node in turn then charters working groups with that responsibility. So the release working group maintains their own process, their own policy, and is able to act autonomously. And the thing that's rather interesting here is that the release working group in a way sets the direction of the project, because they decide what goes out in the release, and even the technical steering committee doesn't tell the working group what to do. Now, within the working group's governance, there are things that are documented where they defer to the technical steering committee. So for example, the working group membership, which I think starts to get towards your question, Dan, which I promise I will get to. states that the seats are not time limited and there's no fixed size. There's no specific set of requirements or qualifications beyond these rules. The working group may add additional members to the working group by consensus, defined as no objections and more than 50% of the members participating in the discussion. A working group member may be removed. Changes to the membership should be posted to the agenda. And also that no more than 1/3 of the working group may be affiliated with the same employee. Now, this is slightly different to being a releaser, which is like a subset. Not everyone on the working group is a releaser. So when considering new releasers, we email the technical steering committee for approval. After approval, the nominee will be assigned a mentor from the release team who walks them through the process of learning how to prepare a release. They work consistently with them, often for many months before they onboard. And then before they're fully onboarded to the team, they need to be added to the team. They need to be added to the security release team, which I don't think we're going to get too much into our security process today, but we have a whole distinct set of repos and stuff for managing our security. They have a single high quality SSH key that's added to the dist user on our server, and their GPG key gets added to the README, and they open pull request to Docker node to add our key because it's part of our automations. And we generally wait at least 2 weeks after that key's been added to propagate before they start actually signing releases. And what's cool is we actually have, like separately from this, a build working group that maintains the secrets repo. And the secrets repo, we can actually see, for example, on our test infrastructure. We use the keys of people who have access to lock the secrets so that people can get the SSH keys to sign into our resources. Now, not everyone from the release team has access to this, but just another example of how we use GPG within the project. So these individuals are the ones that actually manage the releases, and they're onboarded and vetted through an ongoing process. Generally, but not always, the majority of the release team and releasers, if we go back and look at this main repo, most of them work for large companies. So for example, Beth works for Red Hat, Colin, I believe, works for Joyent, James works for, I'm spacing out the name of the company, Nearform, which is a really well-respected vendor in the space. Michael, though, is a student, and he's on the technical steering committee. He's a long-term trusted member of the project. There's myself at GitHub, Richard at Red Hat. Rod is another long-term trusted contributor. Ruben is another individual who is an independent right now, but long-time trusted individual. Roy is also at GitHub, and Shelly's at Microsoft. So a good majority of the team do work for large companies, and large companies that are very active in the repo, which makes it much easier to kind of trust individuals, because if they screw around, their jobs could be at risk. So that helps us trust and bond them. But in general, we do run a lot of mentoring sessions. Every other week, we run a mentoring session that people can connect to and ask questions and kind of see how we go through the release process. And then every other Thursday, we have a release working group where we talk about our schedule, and people can also come and participate in those. So there are some folks that are not working at very large companies who come and participate over extended periods of time and build trust. And it's kind of at the point where we feel we really trust those individuals that we will nominate them for the release, at which point, they do also get vetted by the technical steering committee. Are there any questions about what I've brought up until now?
I guess the one thing you mentioned, there's a limit. Was it on the releasing team about how many people can work for the same employer?
Yeah, the release working group itself says no more than 1/3. I don't know if we have governance specifically to releasers. Yeah, so the governance doesn't explicitly apply to the releasers, but it applies to the release working group itself, which actually has a slightly larger. So there's an LTS group, there's a backporters group, there's a releasers team, and there's a SITGIM team, and kind of all of these members come together. honestly, like we've shifted the membership and setup of this team a couple times, so that actually is a reasonable thing to point out, that we may actually need to go through and kind of rethink the governance there. But at the moment, to the best of my understanding, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we have 10 people. I don't believe there is any company that has 4 people on the team right now. But yeah, I could see how maybe we're not 100% to that right now. So that's worth digging into, Dan.
I was just going to ask how you, I mean, yeah, you kind of answered the question. My question was going to be how you monitor, keep up to date with that. And I guess the answer is it hasn't been a big enough problem to really be worth trying to track.
Yeah, so historically, until I would say the last 2.5 or so years, we were significantly understaffed on the release side of things. And it wasn't until more recently that we started getting a lot more people involved. So this just is something likely that we need to go through and review. But it's not been a problem, at least in my perspective, and I definitely have a bias here, but there hasn't been any problem with people on the release team like acting in a way that's untoward or to benefit their organization. As a whole, the project tends to be rather good there. The technical steering committee is the place where we've definitely been like a lot more on top of ensuring that we're not having a disproportionate number of members from one company. But it's definitely worth reviewing this again. Now, you did ask a final question that I haven't gotten to yet, is details on the signing process outlined in verifying binaries. So we have the release GPG keys that are used by each of the releasers. And if I quickly go to release.markdown, you can see the guide that we have that walks through the whole process for our releases. So what we do is we actually have this utility that was created by one of our contributors called Git Secure Tag, which let me just open that up for you all. So this is Git Secure Tag. It was written by Fedor, who's an amazing contributor, former TSC member, is one of the best experts in crypto that I know. And Git only uses SHA-1 hashes when signing, and SHA-1 is generally deprecated. So it Git Secure Tag runs a cat file recursively for every entry sorted alphabetically, enters submodules if present, and hashes file directory names, file contents, and submodules recursively again, and resulting in a Git EV tag v0 SHA-512 digest. So what that ends up looking like is if we go to like one of our releases here and we look at the actual like release commit. I guess it's not showing the signature on here, but you end up with a slightly more verbose signature with more details in it. So we use this tool, Git Secure Tag, to actually do the signature of the tags themselves. Those tags get pushed up, and then we have a release script that we run, which is this script right now, which will actually go through, and it might be easier to show you in the markdown because we've got it in details. So we've got this tool for promote and signing the release build that essentially selects your GPG key from your private keys, logs into the server, our release server, using the SSH key that you have on file, logs into the server, and it builds all the releases, and it creates the SHA-SUM 256 file, and then signs it using your GPG key. And this is right here, the script that actually goes through and does all the GPG work for that. And if we go and look at like one of the releases on our download page, we can look at like our latest release. You can see that we have this like SHA-SUMS 256. And that gets the SHA-256 of every single file. And then we have a PGP signed version of those SHAs, and then the signature for it. So in here, in our instructions in the README, we have all of the keys of all of the releasers, the commands for grabbing those keys from the SKS key servers. And we have a section on verifying binaries. So you can curl the SHA-SUM. You can then use these commands to essentially pipe it through and verify it against one of our signatures. One thing that we have discussed doing recently, but have not done yet, is switching to using a single GPG key that we would keep within our release infrastructure for all of our releases, instead of using keys for all of our individual contributors. We've also received a complaint in the past about the fact that some of our signers use sub keys, but we keep the primary key in this list of the key list here. For me, for example, I have like a primary key, and then I have a sub key for signing, which I use to sign. But like this key that's listed here is my primary key, which will also get you my sub key. But you know, there is some confusion about this. But overall, we are including, you know, all of our releases. The tag is signed, and then the tarballs that we have, every single one of those tarballs includes that manifest that's signed as well.
I lost track a little bit when you said something about the SSH keys are also checked in, and that's how people get access to the server. So all the releases happen on, I guess, is it the same central server infrastructure, just by different individuals?
Yeah, so we have CI infrastructure for building the releases. All of those releases. So actually, this is worth mentioning. So we have two different CIs. I will show you one of them because it's the public one. So there's ci.nodejs.org, and this is our main continuous integration server. We have a lot of workers, a lot of different platforms that we cover, and this is what people are mainly using when they're doing CI. But we also have CI release. And I'm not going to show this because it's private only to the release team. We hook into and use GitHub IAM to manage the IAM for our Jenkins instances. So our release CI instance is only accessible to the release team and the build team that manage that infrastructure. And it uses build bots that are isolated and only used in the release CI. When we kick off a release job, we have a centralized server that those assets get put onto into a staging directory. And then the release team members create individual keys specifically for that server. And then the public keys are added to it. And the release script that we have to promote our releases from the staging directory to the production directory and create those signed SHA-SUM lists, that piggybacks on that key to SSH into the server and do all those steps that are outlined here in the promotion process of our release. And so for a releaser, you kick off CI and then you use tools release, and that kind of automates the whole process. But under the hood, it is using SSH and GPG for this.
Can you, all right, in a moment, can you go back? Because I wanted to understand how someone would verify this, but I guess looking at this right now, oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead. So they've got to download from the README the signing keys, the public keys.
Yes.
Yeah, this looks similar to the Git Web of Trust thing Constantine showed that that the Linux kernel project uses, except this is kind of in the README instead of, I think there was a special file format for all the keys in Constantine's version.
It's not really. It's just that they're not just the key fingerprints. It's the entire key in the Git repository. The problem is that we had is that you mentioned SKS servers. That SKS servers are slowly dying. They're probably not going to survive for much longer. So we had to find some other mechanism of doing this.
Yeah, that issue with the SKS service is definitely something that has been at the top of my mind, but just not something that we've dug into recently.
I have a question. So this is ultimately depends on the security of the infrastructure, right? You basically delegate everything to the infra and then trust that infra has not been compromised, right? Because so the bit that calculates all the SHA-1, all the hashes and generates all of the signatures is there, and then not the signatures, but to sign the hashes, the person has to SSH to it and forward their agent, right?
Yes, and all of that is automated, but it could be done manually the same way. And only the releasers and a subset of our build team have access to that machine.
Okay. And when you get the initial PGP keys to put into this README, you get it from the GitHub user profile. Is that correct?
The releaser themselves opens a pull request, adding themselves and adding their key. So that process is not automated.
All right. Gotcha. So the initial bootstrap is entirely GitHub identity based. Right. Somebody has to you have to trust that identity of the GitHub person.
Yeah, the pull request to add the key is added by the person who we're working with. And I guess, with that in mind, their GitHub account is the trust that we're using.
Okay.
So and we're also,
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, we're also trusting the health of our repo for the long-term management of those keys.
Okay. So ultimately your identity management part is delegated to GitHub.
Yes.
Okay.
So one thing I noticed in the verifying section, there's this list of keys. There's a section at the bottom too that says some other keys might have been used in the past. Do you happen to know if those keys aren't used anymore because they were lost or compromised, or the person just moved on, or some combination of all of those? Have you ever had to revoke a key or something?
These are emeritus members of the team, so they're no longer releasing.
I see. So it's not like these people had to rotate their own key or something.
No, we've done our best to not rotate keys. To the best of my knowledge, I rotated a key once, but that's why I use subkeys. Right. So I have a subkey that I rotated. I made a new subkey, and as far as the README is concerned, nothing needed to change.
Right. But I guess technically, if somebody did follow all these steps and added all of these releasers, these emeritus releasers keys, and then ran a verification script, they might accidentally think something was verified that wasn't if these people signed a release later. Sorry, that probably didn't make any sense.
No, I think I know what you're saying is that if someone added all of these emeritus keys, I guess I don't see that necessarily as any more of an additional attack surface than any of these individuals having their keys compromised. Right, we have I guess I would call it a keychain of trusted keys, and any one of those keys being compromised could, in theory, break that network of trust. And this is part of the reason why we've looked into, and I'd have to double check which repo it's in, but this is part of the reason why we've explored switching to just using a single centralized project key to sign everything instead of an individual's key.
Yeah, it kind of means once somebody's key has been used to sign a release, it's in that keychain forever, since you don't really have a way to declare which keys were valid at which point in time.
Mm-hmm.
Moving all to one key doesn't really change much, but
well, theoretically, that's why there's expiration. So if you do create subkeys that expire, right, then you sign them with an expired. So, for example, if somebody is an emeritus, then 5 years later they lose their access to the key, or somebody gains it and signs a bogus release with their key, at least that subkey is now expired or something like that. Right. So they would not be present on most people's key rings because they would have to refresh it. Anyway, yes. We're getting into the depths of why this is complicated, and there is no other way of really doing it, unfortunately.
Yeah, but that's exactly actually why I'm using subkeys for signing. Is that I can rotate or expire older keys, and then it's good. No one's going to ever really steal that. But we don't have I know this may sound like a bit of an excuse, but GPG is hard, and it's hard enough at times to just get people to get their systems set up on consistently signing everything, especially since not everyone who is on the release team is an expert with GPG. Although I would maybe even claim that very few people on this planet are. So, you know, that definitely has us where it's like our bar is like having a key, not like having a particular complex setup.
You know, we're definitely not trying to point out flaws or anything here. I guess my motivation for asking you to come and do this presentation is just because I think Node has done a better job than I think 99.99% of other projects I've seen, and most people don't realize how hard this is until they see something like a project that has a dozen maintainers over many years try to do this correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. And for what it's worth, I wasn't trying to be defensive there. It was more just like, this stuff is hard.
Yeah.
So this was an issue that was opened a while ago on a new strategy for managing, sharing, and documenting release keys. And so like we do have this kind of like ongoing conversation and a prototype about like how we manage the keys. So there's like this prototype repo where it would actually be like a separate repo where we keep all the keys. And I think that there was, I'm trying to remember if, yeah, there's a couple different threads that we've had over time. And I bring that up more just to like point out that we are ongoing having discussions, but I would say it definitely becomes difficult because there are only so many experts that we have around this, and it's our project. And I think this is unique to Node, although there are definitely other open source projects like Git that are this way. But Node is primarily volunteer led, and while there are some people on the project that are paid by their employers to work on it, like that kind of corporately funded open source is still, it's not the same as having a staff. So like we don't have a roadmap. We have limited resources to what we can do, and I'm often amazed at the infrastructure we have just based on that. But it does make it much harder for larger infrastructural changes. And I would say, and I don't know if this is something that your team is looking at, if there were clear documented best practices or off-the-shelf kind of kitchen sink utilities that we could use to improve these things, that would be huge. And I think that this is just for releases in general. Like our whole release pipeline is super bespoke, and honestly, due to that kind of fragile, and I don't even want to talk about the number of times I've had to like dive into our bash script and make tiny changes because there was like a weird change to the GPG client's output that like breaks our weird script. So it's like, I would love things to be more streamlined.
It looked like you were going to say something a couple minutes ago, Luke. I want to make sure you get a chance.
Oh yeah, no. I was just going to echo the sentiment earlier, which is where I've audited a lot of projects. A majority are not even signing releases, so you're definitely in a good spot.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I think the other thing I noticed, like you mentioned, some of it is node specific, but I saw almost very, very little node specific stuff in what you showed. So I guess it's just this reflection of the sad state that an open source project just trying to release a binary had to build all of this project specific infrastructure, kind of GitHub specific, a tiny bit Jenkins specific, but not really, and then just releasing a couple different binaries. I think any project on GitHub trying to do that would end up building something pretty similar to you over time.
Yeah, I think like a couple of things I can point out there would be like a lot of this infrastructure that we're looking at right now is built in like 2014 and 2015. And so there has been a lot of advances in automation technology since then, but it's just like, well, we have this system that works and it's like scary to try to change it. I, for one, would love a system where like that we have like kind of ephemeral build infrastructure so that we don't have kind of like long living infrastructure. I would also love our resources to perhaps be hosted more statically in like buckets as opposed to on an actual server. They're being served by a CDN, but there's definitely a lot of room for improvement here. And I would say like separately from this, like in my role at GitHub, I'm a product manager in the code to cloud org, and primarily focused right now on NPM, but also thinking about like holistic end-to-end developer experience. And one of the things I definitely have an itch to solve, although I have a giant bias around it, is like improving some of these things around releases. So for Node, it definitely becomes a challenge because the platform matrix that we support covers machines that just you can't get in continuous integration anywhere. Like we build for like ARMS, we have like a cluster of Raspberry Pi 1s sitting in in someone's garage in Australia. You know, like the build matrix that we need is not totally covered. But then, and I don't mean this as a plug for my organization, it's just what I know, like GitHub's Actions are starting to support like custom built bots. So something I'm personally interested in is like, you know, like whether it's Tecton or Jenkins or some of the open source software that's out there, like what are ways in which we can make this more portable and reusable and less needing like really custom handheld infrastructure to keep this kind of stuff up.
So the Linux Foundation Release Engineer team is managing releases for a whole bunch of open source projects that are part of the Linux Foundation. And I know OpenJS is sort of affiliated with the Linux Foundation, but is not really managed by them. But there are a lot of the things that the team has approached that I believe have been solved fairly sanely. So for example, there is release keys, but they're not available to any member of the team. There's a back-end, front-end process that is all the tags, get tags, and all the releases and the tarballs and binaries are signed using a key that is done on the back-end infrastructure that's behind a whole bunch of firewalls, so that key is not accessible to anybody but the members of the system administration team. So even release engineers don't have access to that. And so that sounds like you are trying to get to the same place where the members of the release engineering team are already at. So maybe that's one of the ways to talk to those folks. Maybe they can come and present that part, saying, you know, here's how we sign releases using Jenkins, using Garrett, or using GitHub Actions or Azure Actions. There's any number of ways to do it. They're all using different infrastructure, but the way the release is assigned and the tags assigned are very similar among the projects. This uses Sigil, which is a tool that's developed by Fedora infrastructure. It's like the actual signing key lives on a system that only connects out to the bridge, right? So they all talk to the bridge. The client says, here, I have a binary, please sign it for me. And so that the request itself is signed by ephemeral certificate. And then we verify that the certificate matches. And then the bridge then says to the server that's connected to it, this is, the client says, I checked their certificate. They say, please sign this binary with the following key. And then the server then signs it and says, here's your signature. And then that is transmitted back to the agent. So that's kind of how Fedora infrastructure signs all of their packages. And we've adopted this mechanism for all the releases done by the release engineer team.
Interesting. Now, is that only for GPG signing, or is there anything in there for notarizing native applications? Because we also, and I didn't really get into it, we have like .pkgs and .msis that we distribute that we need to notarize. Is there any infrastructure for that kind of work?
So currently it's only doing PGP stuff, but Fedora has the same need to do this. So we are working with them to get all this stuff in. So signing your MSIs and signing all of your Mac stuff, for example, all the binaries for them, would also be accomplishable using the same mechanism. So that, you know, you can request, give me this kind of signature for this kind of binary, and then, you know, and there's actually X509 certificates used for the actual communication process. So you issue an agent, sort of like a very short-lived certificate from a CA saying, you know, this is good for the next 3 months. If it's stolen, nobody can request. First of all, if it's stolen and we know about this, we can revoke it. But if it's stolen and we don't know about this, at least it's only worth 3 months. There's a very limited exposure for it. But the actual key that is doing the signing is never exposed to anybody except like the IT administration team, which is like 10 people.
All right, cool. Yeah, there are ongoing conversations with our build team and the Linux Foundation's IT team. I don't know if it's the exact same people, but like we definitely run into like scalability and availability issues. So I'm going to ping the folks who are involved in those conversations to make sure that they're touching on this as well.
Yeah, probably the people in the information IT side, you're talking to the right ones.
Yeah.
Be able to tell you the exact thing. And if it's interesting to more people to present here, then somebody can come and I can talk to them and say, you know, here's how the Linux Foundation releases are done for like 15, 20 projects, however many that we're doing, that, uses various infrastructure, not just Jenkins, but also GitHub Actions or Azure or whatever. But it's all the binaries assigned in this process that I described.
Yeah, that's great. We've historically been very like self-contained for a number of like technical and political reasons, but it's definitely alluring to see if we could, distribute this a little more or use like slightly more robust infrastructure.
So the upside of this is you don't have to depend on us to do this. You perfectly set this up on your own.
Okay, cool.
So have you ever thought of utilizing some sort of immutable append-only record of the artifact, the releases that are signed, and by which key? So that way you would have protections against freeze attacks, for example, or a targeted attack where somebody somehow conceals a later release. So somebody retrieves what they believe to be the latest release, but it's in fact a release that has a known vulnerability. So is that something that you've thought about? It's something that, that was relatively easy to integrate into your CI process. So that way there'll be like a sort of a transparency log of your releases and who signed what with what key. So that way you can monitor who signed what artifact, what hash it was, and then have that in a sort of a tamper-proof record. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely makes sense. We do have something kind of like this, but it's not immutable. We have like a thing we call index.tab and index.json that are available on the download server that have the information from us on every single release. It includes some metadata, such as like whether or not it was a security release and the versions of all of our like embedded dependencies, as well as like the specific platforms and files that are available. But I guess like the two major differences between what we're doing and what it sounds like you're suggesting is one, this file is mutable. It gets appended every single time, but like it's not like we have no way of like confirming this file will like never be changed over time. So maybe that mutability, but that mutability in general is actually something that we need to talk about as a team as to like how we source our static resources. The other thing in there is that there is none of the information about like who the releaser was, what key it got signed with, or the SHAs. But I guess we're relying on, our static hosting not being man in the middle, essentially.
Sure.
Which, only helps so much.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, because it's very, very early on, and it's not an open SSF effort at the moment, although it could potentially become one. Myself and Dan have been hacking on a prototype, which does exactly this. And when we were talking, we thought it might be, it struck us as being something that would be well integrated with Node and the signing system that you have. So it's something that we could possibly explore and look at.
Is that something that TUF does, TUF?
Not really. No, it's it's basically it's a transparency log. So right. It's effectively a Merkle tree. And once you record an entry in there, so you take an artifact, you hash it, you associate with a public key, it goes in and then it's permanently recorded. And then anybody can audit the system. They can measure they can monitor the log for entries and then look at things such as the signature, who signed it, what its hash state is, when that happened, the actual time that happened. And it's a means to sort of protect against, like I said, targeted attacks or freeze attacks, replay attacks, that sort of thing. And it's just a good way of monitoring who signed what and them not being able to conceal or make that information rendered different to different parties as part of some sort of targeted attack.
How do you check that? How would somebody check to make sure that it's one thing to have an audited log, like an audit log like this, right? but another thing for somebody to say, well, how do you integrate this into the thing that checks to make sure that this is the, you know, this release is actually the newest, or it hasn't been pulled back or anything like that. That's the problem that I always run into, because, for example, at the kernel side of things, we want to create like an audit log of all the Git commits that have been done and all the releases have been done, and that actually is committed into the Git repository that's then replicated, you know, fast forward only, right? So if any changes are made to it in the back end, like I want to do it, or anybody else sneaks in and tries to say, oh, no, this commit didn't actually happen or anything like that, then those repositories will just stop replicating. It will be obvious that this is broken. But the problem I always run into is that, yeah, it's great to have it for forensics, but how do we make use of this on the client-side tooling? You know, when you know a packager wants to release a package, the npm for their distribution or for anything else, how do they go and check that to make sure that everything is kosher, right?
Yeah, I think the easiest example of an attack that what Luke was describing we can mitigate would be something like if one of those old emeritus releasers in the node repo had their key compromised, somebody could do a targeted attack, like take a tampered release of node, sign it with that old key that they found, and then give it to a couple people, and those people would check and it would validate. They can even make it look like one of the newer versioned releases. To use that transparency log, then in the instructions or in any client-side tooling to validate a release of node, you would also have to check to make sure that that signature was in the public record. And you would also need people watching that public record to make sure that all of the entries that show up in there that were signed with their public key were actually signed by them. So it's kind of a way, I guess, just to alert those people that their keys were compromised and used to sign something that they didn't necessarily intend to.
Yeah, and this is complicated too, because like for a while back there was a tool called rget, right? That used Let's Encrypt's infrastructure basically to record a release, but it had a major flaw that I thought, because that if somebody wants to create another record of another release with a different hash, right? That would just be two records, and rget would say, "Yep, this is good," and somebody would actually have to monitor continuously to make sure that there are no duplicate records created. And this is the same. It's the same problem for all of these blockchain-like systems. That you can check to make sure that is this binary or this hash in this record, and the answer could be yes, it is, but it may not be the correct one. Right? It could be somebody snuck it in there.
Right. So rget worked as and there's a new version of it called transparencylog.com if you want to find the new version. But rget was basically a map of URL to hash in a transparency log. So anybody fetching contents from a URL, you could make sure that it was the same hash that went to everybody else that fetched from that URL. I think the problem you're talking about is just that most URLs change and are designed to change. Most people don't treat URLs as immutable. Right. And so you'd end up with a whole bunch of records from that same URL. There are some kind of projects, I guess, like some of those node URLs Miles was showing us are kind of designed to be immutable. So they would probably want to know if the contents at in a specific thing from that dist.nodejs.org changed. But they wouldn't necessarily about something that was kind of in more of a latest or mutable tag. I think rget suffered from not having a way for people that maintain and own those URLs to declare whether or not it was supposed to be immutable.
Yeah, so the majority of our tags are immutable, but we do have aliases. So like we have latest, we have like a latest tag for each of the release lines and each of our LTS code names. And so for tools like NVM, which is a version manager that a lot of people use to install Node, which does, to the best of my knowledge, verify the SHA sums before installing. You could just do like NVM install Node and it will install the latest version of Node based on both that index tab and that current alias that we have. And you can do that for each of the individual release lines, and we'll get the latest version of that release line and be able to verify the SHA sum as well. I think the attack that you were talking about, Dan, where someone's GPG key was compromised, for it to reach our release server, it would likely need to be a combination of both their key getting compromised, their GPG key, but also their SSH key, and we rotate the keys on the server so that we make sure that only the active releasers have their keys on there. So without that SSH key, they wouldn't have access to the machine. It's not perfect, but it's
Yeah.
better than nothing.
Yeah, so I think just to really complete the story though, on what you were asking, Konstantin, you would need something like a service that would let you kind of subscribe to that transparency log, like even an Argit, to like look for certain changes to URLs. Like if you owned a URL, you could theoretically, I think Brandon's talked about this, subscribe, and the system would email you or something like that anytime the content's changed. The same would be true for the public key signing log, like Luke is talking about. Like somebody like Linus might want to get an email every time a Linux kernel gets signed with his
Yeah, the problem is that there is email fatigue, right? And alert fatigue. And it's all, unless it's automated and that infra is guaranteed to last for the next, 5-10 years, which is improbable in best cases, right? All of these fail down at some point. So yeah, we can create all of these checks and balances and automation, but unless the end user who is consuming this tool knows about them and knows how to use them and doesn't forget or just doesn't care to verify them, this is basically just creating more complexity that in the end does not actually get us any more security. Is what I'm saying. It is difficult enough that, for example, when I ask, just it stays in here, but 3 years ago I asked Fedora infrastructure, say, do you actually verify kernels that you download from kernel.org? And the answer was, we don't actually. We kind of trust that the HTTPS process is sufficiently secure in the infrastructure, and both sides sufficiently secure that we don't have to do it. I yelled at them and said, please stop doing this. And they have stopped doing this. They actually will verify those kernels now. So if we're talking like a major distribution, right, that is not doing this, what hope do we have for the just general end users doing this, right? Which is the programs like MSI signing and what Apple does on their side. I'm not sure, I don't use it, but this is better, but it also is incredible gatekeeping, right? So we are trading off the freedoms of open source and liberty and whatnot to having this tremendous gatekeepers in place saying you're not allowed to release this binary and have it run in our system, versus the almost guarantee that nobody's going to check that this is a valid binary. So we kind of between these two anvils.
Yeah, I guess the one example of something working out like this, I guess recently, would be the Go modules transparency log effort, where they kind of baked the validation into the Go get command by default in all new versions of Go. So everybody installing dependencies is kind of acting as a check without even maybe realizing it. It's sort of like if something bad does happen, it's sort of like SSH blowing up and saying, hey, something like when an SSH server-side key gets changed, it says, this might not be what you want. Take a look here more closely. So kind of they've kind of not tricked, but used the entire ecosystem of people installing things with Go to start acting as a distributed watcher.
Right, we are going way into the tangents now.
Yeah, we're way down. Yeah. I guess we have 1 minute left and people are starting to drop. Any other questions, or just thanks a lot for presenting today, Miles?
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Great. Is that it then?
Bye, everyone. Yeah.
Okay, bye.